This is it, and see you in July.
The world thought it was witnessing a comeback, but behind the bright lights of that rehearsal stage lay a ticking time bomb that no one dared to defuse. To millions, Michael Jackson's This Is It tour promised redemption, revival, and the rebirth of a legend. But to those inside the rehearsal halls, every note, every step, and every breath carried the weight of a man walking a tightrope between glory and collapse. This Is It was billed as history in the making of a final coronation for the King of Pop. 50 sold-out shows at London's O2 Arena, with fans flying from every corner of the globe, hungry to see the icon they believed would rise again. Yet the man at the center of it all was not the immortal performer from Thriller or Billie Jean. He was frail, his movements rehearsed not out of joy but out of obligation. Crew members whispered that his hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. His words sometimes slurred, as if the energy required to speak clearly was too great a burden. And his eyes, those famous piercing eyes, seemed distant, glassy, as though they were locked in a private world of suffering no one else could enter. Still, the machine kept running. Promoters demanded perfection. Billions of dollars were on the line. For Michael, there was no escape route, no chance to simply say no. The rehearsals became a masquerade, a show within a show, where cameras captured flashes of brilliance while hiding the agony behind the curtain. To the public, he looked invincible. To those backstage, he looked breakable. One dancer later recalled moments when Michael had to be gently guided off stage, his body buckling under the strain, only to return minutes later with the same explosive spins and iconic moonwalk that had once electrified stadiums. It was a paradox too cruel to ignore the greatest showman alive, rehearsing with a passion that seemed eternal, while privately fighting a body and spirit that were running out of time. His final stage was not a celebration. It was a countdown. But the glittering stage was hiding a secret. No one in the audience could see a secret about who was really controlling Michael's final days. And when it surfaced, it changed everything. Was Michael Jackson truly rehearsing for himself, or had he become a prisoner to forces far greater than fame? To the world, the This Is It concerts looked like a dream fulfilled, the long-awaited return of the King of Pop. But behind the velvet curtains and glowing spotlights, another stage was being set, one where power, money, and control held the script, and Michael was merely the performer trapped inside a role he could no longer escape. The rehearsals were never about artistry alone. They were about survival. Promoters demanded perfection, and contracts were written in stone. 50 concerts already sold out meant billions of dollars tied to his fragile shoulders. There was no margin for error, no room for weakness. For every step he took on stage, lawyers and executives stood in the shadows, watching, calculating, ensuring that the man who once defined music was now nothing more than a commodity to be delivered. Michael Jackson, the artist, had become Michael Jackson, the product. Those who worked closest to him, the dancers, choreographers, and musicians, sensed it. His detachment was impossible to ignore. One moment he would erupt into brilliance, electrifying the room with the energy of his youth. The next, he would stand motionless, shoulders hunched, lips moving as if rehearsing words only he could hear. His voice, once capable of silencing arenas with its soaring purity, cracked under pressure. Sometimes he sang in whispers, sometimes he skipped notes altogether, and yet no one dared to stop the machine. The contracts were too binding. The money was too great. His very life was becoming the collateral of an empire too hungry to let him rest. Whispers circulated among insiders. "He's being pushed like a racehorse about to break," one recalled. Another admitted that when Michael stumbled during a rehearsal, no one offered to pull him aside for fear of being fired. The silence of those around him was not loyalty, it was fear. Fear of losing their jobs, fear of losing the spectacle, fear of losing the greatest show that had ever been promised but never delivered. And in that silence, Michael's pain was allowed to grow unchecked. Doctors became fixtures in his world, shuffled in and out like stagehands in a play. Each came with bottles, prescriptions, promises of relief that only deepened the cycle. It wasn't just insomnia, it was exhaustion layered with anxiety, depression, and the weight of history pressing down on him. At night, pills replaced sleep. In the morning, stimulants replaced energy. By evening, his body was burning at both ends, and still, he stood beneath the lights, giving everything he had left. What looked like rehearsals for a triumphant return was, in truth, a desperate attempt to keep alive an empire already collapsing from within. Michael himself knew he was drowning. Friends later revealed he confided in them about his fear of failing the tour, his terror that fans would see a ghost of the man they once adored. Yet he could not walk away. To cancel was unthinkable. Too many people depended on him, too much money hung in the balance, too many promises had already been sold. He was cornered by contracts, bound by obligations, and suffocated by those who claimed to serve him but instead served the empire feeding on his name. Every night he rehearsed, not as an artist but as a prisoner shackled to a stage. His legacy was no longer his own, it was in the hands of puppet masters pulling strings from boardrooms, counting profits while ignoring the cost. And as the show drew closer, the gap between the public illusion and the private torment only widened. But Michael's struggle against his handlers was only the beginning. His greatest enemy wasn't outside the rehearsal hall, it was inside his own fragile body. The world saw a superstar gliding across the stage, but his body was screaming a very different truth. To the fans who caught glimpses of Michael's rehearsals, he still looked like the untouchable king of pop, a man who could defy age and gravity. But behind the sharp spins and familiar gestures lay a body that had been battered, broken, and patched together more times than anyone dared admit. At 50 years old, Michael was no longer the child prodigy who once commanded stages with uncontainable energy. His body carried decades of punishment, endless world tours that robbed him of rest, accidents that left his back and legs in chronic pain, and surgeries that left invisible wounds that never fully healed. His knees, weakened from years of moonwalking across arenas, often buckled without warning. His spine ached from a lifetime of choreography that demanded perfection. And yet the expectation remained unchanged, to deliver performances that outshined even his prime. Behind the curtain, the contrast was shocking. Younger dancers, many in their 20s, would collapse in exhaustion after hours of rehearsing the grueling setlist. But Michael was pushed to keep going, his every stumble treated as a flaw to be corrected rather than a sign of collapse. Those close to him noticed the signs: he skipped meals, sometimes going entire days without eating. His frame grew thinner, his skin paler, his movements jittery. And when he tried to rest, the demons of insomnia clawed at him, leaving him reliant on sleep aids that dulled his body but never truly gave him peace. Crew members whispered their fears in private. They saw him appear disoriented, his eyes hollow, his voice breaking mid-sentence. Some believed it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. But no one dared speak those fears aloud. The stakes were too high. To admit Michael was too frail would mean jeopardizing the empire that depended on his survival. And still, Michael refused to surrender. His perfectionism, the same force that had propelled him to global dominance, now became his curse. He pushed through every ache, every tremor, every dizzy spell. When his body screamed, he danced harder. When his lungs burned, he sang louder. He would not allow the world to see weakness, even as it consumed him from within. It was the cruelest contradiction of an artist whose brilliance was unmatched, trapped inside a body that was betraying him with every passing hour. And as his health deteriorated, so did his confidence. The king of pop began to fear the very thing that once defined his voice. Imagine being the world's greatest singer and suddenly doubting every note that leaves your lips. For Michael Jackson, a man whose voice had once shattered records and hypnotized entire stadiums, the slow unraveling of that gift was nothing short of torment. The one instrument that had always been his salvation, the voice that had lifted him from a childhood of abuse and into immortality, now betrayed him when he needed it most. His rehearsals for this it revealed a haunting contrast. Some nights, his voice would glide effortlessly into the high notes of human nature, fragile but still unmistakably magical. But on other nights, it broke apart, reduced to whispers where there should have been belts, breaths where there should have been soaring crescendos. The cracks weren't just physical, they were psychological. Michael knew the world expected perfection, and each missed note cut into him like a blade. He muttered under his breath that he wasn't ready, his confidence collapsing under the weight of expectation. Years of battles had left scars, not just on his body but on his vocal cords. Endless court trials, accusations, and nights spent drowning in stress had robbed him of sleep and drained his stamina. Add to that decades of relentless performing, surgeries, and dependency on sedatives, and the once indestructible golden voice began to falter. He leaned on backing tracks to fill the gaps, a safety net that only reminded him of what he was losing. To the crew, it was a technical adjustment. To Michael, it was humiliation. Witnesses recall moments when he would stop mid-song, shaking his head in frustration, his soft voice barely audible as he admitted, "I can't." Then, as if fueled by pure defiance, he would summon his old magic and stun everyone with a burst of brilliance. One note, One phrase, one soaring line would silence the room, leaving them convinced the king still lived. That duality, genius and fragility, power and collapse turned rehearsals into an emotional roller coaster no one dared ride too close. Privately, he confided in a few that his voice no longer felt like his own. It wavered without warning, cracking like glass under pressure. He feared he would open the tour in London, only to fail in front of the very fans who had defended him through scandal and ruin. For Michael, that was worse than death. And so he rehearsed obsessively, trying to wrestle control of an instrument slipping through his fingers. His voice had once freed him. Now it was chaining him. The irony was unbearable. The boy who had been pushed onto stages before he could even spell his own name had grown into a man terrified of those same stages. He had spent his life running from silence, filling it with music that defined generations. But now, silence was winning. And though his team applauded the flashes of brilliance, Michael heard only the flaws. Each cracked note echoed his deepest fear that the world's love for him was conditional, that without perfection, he was nothing. But just as he feared losing his voice, a darker fear crept in the possibility of losing his life before the curtain ever rose. Who was really keeping Michael alive during those rehearsals, and what were they giving him to survive? To the world, Michael seemed fragile but determined, a superstar clawing his way back to the top. But inside his mansion, away from the cameras, a far more disturbing routine was unfolding. It was a ritual of needles, vials, and whispered reassurances delivered by the one man entrusted with his health, Dr. Conrad Murray. Murray wasn't just a physician. He was Michael's constant shadow, a figure who hovered on the edges of rehearsals, waiting with the tools that promised sleep but carried the seeds of destruction. What began as legitimate treatment for insomnia soon spiraled into a dangerous cycle of nightly sedation. Michael couldn't sleep naturally anymore. His body had been rewired by years of anxiety, pressure, and dependency. Murray's answer wasn't therapy or rest. It was chemicals. Sedatives became lullabies. Intravenous drips became routine. The very act of closing his eyes demanded a doctor's hand. Those close to Michael saw the signs. His fatigue during rehearsals, his slurred speech, the fog in his gaze, these weren't just the effects of exhaustion. They were the echoes of nights spent under the influence of drugs meant for hospital operating rooms, not bedrooms. Propofol, a powerful anesthetic, became his forbidden companion. It was nicknamed milk for its white color, a seemingly harmless label for a drug that could silence breathing in seconds. Michael begged for it, convinced it was the only way he could rest. Murray, against every medical oath, complied. During the day, Michael forced his body past the breaking point, sweating under the punishing demands of choreography that belonged to a man half his age. At night, he surrendered himself completely, allowing chemicals to mimic the sleep his mind and soul had long forgotten how to find. It was a cruel cycle: work until collapse, medicate until unconscious, wake in a fog, and begin again. Each rehearsal, each injection, pulled him further from recovery and closer to the abyss. Insiders later revealed that Murray wasn't the first doctor to enable Michael's desperate dependence. For decades, physicians had come and gone, prescribing cocktails of pills to manage pain, anxiety, and sleeplessness. But Murray was different. He wasn't just a doctor, he was the gatekeeper to the most dangerous drug of all, a drug no responsible physician would ever use outside a hospital. And yet, in Michael's private bedroom, with no monitors, no safety nets, Murray set up a nightly theater of sedation. To Michael, these drugs felt like salvation. To his fans, they would become the weapon that ended his life. Each injection bought him a few hours of rest, but it also robbed him of his strength, weakened his body, and blurred his focus. The very thing meant to sustain him was silently destroying him. The rehearsals were killing him by inches, and those entrusted with his care were complicit. And then came the breaking point. June 25, 2009. The morning when the curtain fell before the concert ever began. The rehearsals ended not with applause, not with fireworks, but with silence that echoed across the world, leaving fans and family to wonder how the king of pop had been allowed to slip away under the watch of the man sworn to protect him. He walked into the rehearsal hall as a legend preparing for history. He left in an ambulance that carried him into eternity. To the cameras, it was just another night of preparation for This Is It. To those in the room, it was a night that felt heavy, charged, and strangely final, as if Michael Jackson knew he was bowing not for a concert, but for life itself. The last rehearsals were drenched in contradiction. When the music began, he transformed into the superstar the world had always known. He moved with precision, his arms slicing the air, his voice carrying just enough power to remind everyone why he was the king of pop. Then, as soon as the music stopped, the mask fell. His body hunched, his breath grew shallow, and his skin took on a pallor that terrified those close enough to see it. One moment, radiant. The next, ghostly. It was as though he existed between two worlds, half alive, half already gone. On that fateful night, he performed Earth Song. It wasn't just rehearsal, it was a revelation. He sang with a rawness that startled even his most seasoned collaborators. His voice cracked with pain, and when he hit the final note, he collapsed into sobs. Some whispered that he looked like a man saying goodbye. For those standing in the shadows of the stage, it was chilling, as though the music itself was pulling something out of him he could no longer contain. Crew members later admitted they had goosebumps watching him. They couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was pouring the last fragments of his soul into that stage, as though he knew he might never stand on it again. His bow wasn't grand, it wasn't theatrical, it was almost private. A slight nod, a weary smile, a glance toward the heavens. That was his final curtain call. Not before an arena of 50,000, but before a handful of stunned staff who didn't realize they were witnessing history. Hours later, the scene shifted from rehearsal stage to bedroom. The performer who had once commanded stadiums larger than cities now lay motionless in his private quarters. The monitors, the vials, the hands of Dr. Conrad Murray all became part of a grim theater of failure. His bedroom, meant to be a sanctuary, transformed into a crime scene. By dawn, news spread across the globe. The king of pop was gone. Fans wept in disbelief. Crowds gathered outside hospitals and lit candles as if clinging to hope that the news was wrong. Yet for those who had seen him in those final rehearsals, the tragedy was not entirely a shock. They had watched his body betray him in real time. They had seen the trembling hands, the sudden lapses, the desperate dependence on outside forces to keep him moving. For them, the only surprise was not that he was gone, it was that he had held on for as long as he did. The greatest entertainer the world had ever known had been rehearsing for a concert that would never come. Instead, those final hours became his real performance, one of courage, fragility, and haunting inevitability. He left behind not a triumphant opening night, but a silence that roared louder than any standing ovation. Yet even in death, Michael wasn't free. The battles over his final rehearsals had only just begun. The footage, the contracts, the secrets of what happened behind those closed doors would ignite a war that threatened to stain his legacy forever. Why did Michael's team release this as footage, and what truths were they trying to hide? The concert that was supposed to redefine his legacy never took place. Instead, the only glimpse the world would ever get of Michael's final act came not from a stage in London, but from the cutting room floor of a Hollywood studio. What emerged was a carefully constructed film, one that made Michael appear triumphant, brilliant, and ready for the world. But behind the glossy edit lay hours of haunting footage that told a very different story. This is it painted Michael as a man in control. The choreography looked sharp, the voice seemed strong enough, the energy convincing. To the millions who saw the film, it was proof that the king of pop was preparing to reclaim his throne. Yet insiders knew better. The raw reels, the uncut recordings, captured a reality no one wanted to acknowledge. They showed a man stumbling through steps he once invented, forgetting lyrics he had sung for decades, pausing mid-song with eyes clouded by fatigue. One day he radiated light, the next he looked hollow, almost spectral. It wasn't the footage of a comeback. It was the footage of a collapse. Executives knew what was at stake. Billions of dollars in estate earnings, brand protection, and a global audience still hungry for Michael Jackson. Releasing raw truth meant admitting failure, admitting negligence, perhaps even admitting guilt. So the film became something more than a tribute, it became damage control. Scenes of exhaustion were cut away. The audio was polished. Broken notes were softened or buried under backing tracks. What could not be hidden was reframed as artistry. The man who had been collapsing in rehearsals was shown instead as meticulous, driven, and visionary. Fans around the world wept watching the film, believing they were seeing Michael at his most intimate. But those who had been in the rehearsal hall knew it wasn't intimacy, they were watching it as an illusion. This Is It was not just the name of a tour. It became a final mask placed over the truth of Michael's suffering. Insiders later admitted the project had one unspoken mission: to shield the industry from blame. If Michael looked strong, no one would ask how he died so weak. And yet, the haunting question lingers. If the raw footage had been shown, would the world have demanded answers sooner? Would the story of his death have been seen not as tragedy alone, but as the inevitable result of exploitation and neglect? Instead, the movie turned grief into profit, and the cameras that had recorded his decline became tools to rewrite his ending. But the fight over those images was nothing compared to the war within his own family. When the King of Pop died, his family didn't just grieve, they went to war. The shock of Michael's passing quickly turned into fury, and for the Jacksons, mourning was inseparable from a demand for justice. They believed his death was not an accident of fate but the result of systematic exploitation, and they were determined to expose the machinery that had pushed him past the point of no return. The Jackson family's accusations cut deep. Promoters had promised fans 50 flawless shows, but behind the scenes they had allegedly ignored warning after warning about Michael's fragile health. Contracts, meticulously crafted, were revealed to prioritize profits above his well-being, locking him into a schedule that even a man half his age would have struggled to survive. His siblings claimed they begged him to walk away. Jermaine and Randy warned him he didn't have to prove himself again. Janet urged him to think about his children instead of the stage. But Michael, with that familiar mix of defiance and duty, waved them away. "I have to do this for the fans," he told them. That line became his shield, and also his prison. Then came the lawsuits. Courtrooms turned into arenas of their own, with lawyers battling over responsibility for Michael's death. The family painted a portrait of conspiracy and negligence, ignored doctors' notes, falsified health assurances, and financial clauses that made cancellation impossible. They argued that Michael had been cornered, pushed beyond human limits by men who saw him not as a brother or father, but as an irreplaceable asset. Testimonies revealed chilling details: how warnings of his declining health were dismissed, how concerns from crew members were silenced, how the pressure on him only increased as his condition worsened. The rehearsals, once meant to be remembered as artistry, became evidence. Clips of Michael stumbling, whispering instead of singing, or asking for breaks were replayed not as performances but as proof of abuse. His final songs were dissected not by critics but by attorneys, each note weighed for signs of exhaustion, each falter held up as evidence that he was being destroyed by the very show that was supposed to save him. The family's grief became fuel for their fight. Katherine Jackson, his mother, sat in court and listened as witnesses described her son as a man too weak to stand, yet forced to perform. To her, it was confirmation of what she already believed: Michael had been sacrificed for money. His brothers and sisters echoed the same message to the press, declaring that their brother had been murdered by greed. But not everyone agreed. Some argued that Michael himself had insisted on the scale of the show, that his perfectionism would have demanded nothing less. Others said the family was deflecting blame, refusing to admit that Michael's own reliance on dangerous medication had hastened his end. The courtroom battles dragged on, exposing every fracture, every contradiction in Michael's life. And yet, one truth grew clearer with every testimony: the King of Pop's final days were engineered, not by fate, but by forces that valued ticket sales above human life. To his family, that was unforgivable. Their revenge wasn't just about legal victory, it was about reclaiming Michael's dignity from the circus that had consumed him. But through all the chaos, one haunting question lingered like a shadow in every courtroom, every press conference, every whispered conversation. Did Michael himself know that his last rehearsal would be his final goodbye? Was Michael Jackson rehearsing for a concert or for his own farewell? In the dim light of that rehearsal stage, cameras caught him one last time, arms raised high, eyes glistening, whispering the words, "I love you," before fading into the shadows. To millions, it looked like a routine goodbye. But for those who have replayed those moments again and again, it feels like something more of an unspoken prophecy, a farewell he somehow knew was coming. Fans still cling to those final clips, studying every gesture, every pause, every strained note, as though hidden inside them is a message from Michael himself. Was he telling the world goodbye? Or was he still fighting, refusing to let go of the stage that defined his life? His last rehearsals revealed a man caught between two identities: the immortal superstar who could summon electricity with a single move, and the fragile soul whose body was unraveling, breath by breath, under the crushing weight of expectation. The paradox was devastating. The world cheered for a comeback concert that would never arrive. Tickets were framed, flights were booked, dreams were set in motion. Yet what Michael was truly rehearsing was not a performance for London, it was a farewell staged before a handful of stunned witnesses. His whispers of love, his nods to the crowd that wasn't there, his fleeting moments of brilliance, they weren't preparations for glory. They were fragments of a goodbye. The truth is chilling. The music stopped, but the silence that followed became louder than any song he ever sang. His death froze him in time, locking him forever at the edge of a stage he would never truly walk onto again. And yet, his last rehearsals, those fragile, haunting glimpses, remain his most unforgettable performance, not because of perfection, but because of the pain and prophecy that clung to every move. And so the curtain fell, not on a stage in London, but on a life that carried the weight of glory, betrayal, and tragedy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.